The Vietnam War started November 1st, 1955. It was fought between Communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam, supported by other non-communist nations, including the United States.
During the war, North Vietnam attempted to start an uprising in South Vietnam with the communists living there. In order to get supplies to these troops and infiltrate South Vietnam, they followed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail came down out of Red China, through North Vietnam, down through Laos, and swung around through the top of Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was made up of complex truck routes and bike paths where supplies such as bullets, food, guns, orders, machine guns, and aircrafts could be transported just across the border through South Vietnam.
Early in the 1960s, U.S. military advisors and the Vietnamese government came together with the primary objective to seal off the hidden supply routes through the mountains from the Communist North. When Special Forces first got to Southeast Asia, their mission was to set up base camps in locations near the borders, where the infiltration routes came in from Laos and Cambodia. Kevin Curry was born in 1947 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He lived there until he was 18. He went to Boston College where he met his wife and they got married 20 days after graduation.
This was '69 when I graduated from college, and there were not a lot of people who were volunteering for it. The political environment was pretty much anti-war. It was an amazing time. Kids should have lived there. It was wild. Protest and campus protest and shutting down schools and then the riots and everything else that broke out. So no, there were not a lot of volunteers that I knew coming out of college going into the Army. I was eligible for the draft coming from Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is not one of your charming places in the world. So part of the fact that we were getting married was that I would volunteer to go into the Army so that I would be able to become an officer through officers training school and therefore be able to support my family.
He began basic training for infantry at Fort Dix, New Jersey. He then continued on to advanced infantry training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He then attended Fort Benning in Georgia for Benning School for Boys, where he graduated top of his class and was second lieutenant upon graduation.
My process was a little bit different than most because I was already trained as an infantry officer, but I was in the Signal Corps for the branch transfer. As a result of that, every Green Beret organization has 2 or 3 signal officers in it. And they were short signal officers. So I volunteered for Special Forces, and I was airborne qualified, which is what you really needed to get into that. And then I took correspondence courses, actually, while I was working with the Green Berets and being a Green Beret. So I worked my way up through the Green Berets by on-the-job training, so to speak. The signal operation is the people who provide the communications, so that from the littlest guy on the ground to the general in the Pentagon, there's a communication network, and that's run by a whole branch of the Army called the Signal Corps.
When he was 22, he was sent to Wilbury, Thailand.
When the Special Forces first got to Southeast Asia, their mission was to basically set up some base camps in strategic locations near the borders.
This land was home to indigenous people called the Montagnards.
It became quite evident to Special Forces, because we think differently than the regular Army in those days, that these people could be very valuable fighters. So I didn't know an awful lot about the people, but I certainly learned quickly when I got there. Because, in fact, where I was stationed, I lived in a hoosh. There were no barracks for me. I lived in a civilian population. There was only 90 of us in the city, town, village, whatever you want to call it, globally. So I learned pretty quick, because if you wanted to eat, there was no mess hall. You had to eat off the economy. So you learned very quickly, picked up the language very quickly. The other Green Berets that had been there for 6, 7, 8 months, we'd all mentor each other as we turned over in terms of the rotation. But you learn pretty quickly if you want to eat.
The United States government assigned the Special Forces to the training of the Thai Red Berets, Cambodian battalions, and the Laotians up north in the training centers in Laos.
Basically built our own little armies. with these people. And they were fierce fighters, very loyal. They didn't do a year in, a year out rotation. They were there for 15 years fighting, many of them, sometimes 20. Daily life, I get up to my hooch. When I was back in base camp, I'd get up to the hooch. I'd go down probably about 6 in the morning to the comm center, see what went on that night. Had about 25 people working for me in there. Meet with the commander. I was part of the staff, which is the 7 or 8 people that are doing various functions that are in charge, of which I was one single officer. The staff would coordinate. We'd make sure that everybody was on the same page for whatever we were doing at that particular time. Maintenance of the equipment is absolutely crucial. So you'd have to supervise, be sure that everything was up to date. Basically training and equipping and communicating. So that would be a normal day. I'd probably get out of there about, I don't know, 8 or 9 at night. But I wasn't there all day long. I had my Jeep and I had my driver, so I could get back and forth. But the driver went home at 6 o'clock, so after that I would get to my hooch on my own. And all of a sudden I wasn't so important because I didn't have my Jeep. I had the latest in communication equipment for the mission. Actually had, in 1972, secure voice to the Pentagon, a red phone. Pick it up, satellite communication, secure voice right to the Pentagon, because our mission sometimes was that critical. So I could talk to my wife and my parents probably 2 or 3 times a week. And I also, on the other end, could patch through to guys that were in the field. And one of the things we used to do for entertainment, because the embassy asked us to do it, we grab a C-130 aircraft, and about 15 of us would volunteer on a Sunday to go as part of the king arriving to town for an airborne show, and we'd jump into town and, put on a, like you see for the Black Knights or the parachute, So that was fun. We get an extra jump out of it. It was fun, and we get down. We were well received. I remember one time turning around, we had a dignitary come. Secretary of the Army came to visit our little humble abode post in Little Marie, and he comes in with all the fanfare. So the people who were in base camp had to put on their dress green uniforms, which meant they had to put their medals on. And I turned around and I looked at my 12 guys, and there were medals that you wouldn't believe. I didn't even know it. Silver Stars, Distinguished Service, Purple Hearts galore.
Kevin Curry came back to the United States in March of 1972. He was part of the Reduction in Force, or RIF, in the attempt to create a smaller army. Instead of serving a full year, he served 9 months, being able to return to his wife and family 3 months early.
What I miss most, of course, is my wife and my kid. My first son was born at Fort Benning, Georgia, on April 28th, 1970. And so when I went over there, he was like 2 and a half. And when I came back home, there was a couple rules in the house, and one of them was there would be no weapons, no toy guns, nothing. I didn't want them to think that it was a freaking game. It was an game.
Around 1973, the United States troops began to pull out of Vietnam, leaving the Montagnards to fend for themselves. Many were killed, but a lucky few of about 12,000 were able to make it to the United States and become citizens near the North Carolina region with the help of the United States.
What I remember are the people I worked with. You just don't forget those people. It becomes very personal. You're not fighting for the country at that point. You're fighting for the guy next to you, and fighting to make sure your men stay alive and get the mission done. And it's very hard between mission and men. It was an interesting time in the United States, politically. It was an interesting time in Southeast Asia. It's just, history that I never thought I'd be part of history because, I didn't think it'd be this old.
Fighting soldiers from the sky, fearless men who jump and die, Men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret.